hashtag Trump is racist, and hashtag racist in chief. Just some of what's been trending on social media platforms after the US president told some women in Congress to go back to the, quote, totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came. It wasn't long before a backlash began. Americans from all walks of life, and politicians too, raising their voices against Donald Trump's tweets, calling them racist and xenophobic. Ilhan Omar, the first Muslim woman to be elected to the US Congress, said, "As a member of Congress, the only country we swear an oath to is the United States." She's been at the receiving end of several of Trump's attacks in the past. Before these latest tweets, US Representative Ilhan Omar talked to Al Jazeera. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Let's start by talking about today's politics in the United States. You've got a president who's arguably the most divisive president you've had in a very long time, to say the least. That division has given way to discourse which is often filled with hate speech against minorities and society's most vulnerable. But at the same time, you've got a Congress which is probably the most diverse that you've also had in a very long time. How's that happened?
I mean, polarization in this country really has existed for a long time. And what we're seeing right now is the unearthing of the kind of cancerous that could really present. But the positive thing is that every time when there is a challenge, there is an opportunity. So because we have the most divisive president, we're living in historically traumatizing time, at least in my generation in this country. So many people are rising up to not only resist the detrimental policies that are coming from this administration, but to also insist on having the America we all know we deserve. And so that's why you're seeing the rise of so many people who have always sat on the margins of society say, this is our time to seek our seat at the table. We have to make sure that we're representing all of our voices.
But I mean, a lot of people would say that those examples of hope, let's say, or positivity in the face of that hatred, they're more anecdotal. They don't necessarily represent a strong enough trend that would give hope. What do you say to them?
I think it's on the contrary. I mean, we've seen what hope and change can produce with Obama, and we're seeing what hope and change can produce with, like you said, the most diverse Congress. There has been a really great opportunity for people to mass mobilize. This particular year, in my district, we increased voter turnout by 100,000. And we did that because people were extremely eager to get involved and make sure that their voice was at the table.
I'm going to come back to Obama and the idea and concept of hope, but let me just stay with Trump here for a second, because he's also been accused of colluding with foreign governments, right, during his campaign, and then obstructing justice in the investigation to that collusion. Do you think that he should be impeached?
I always said it wasn't the question of whether he should be impeached, it's when. And we are seeing now so many people are coming to that conclusion. This president said he didn't see any problem in having a foreign hostile government intervene in our elections. He didn't understand how that could be a problem.
I mean, to be fair, he said he didn't see anything wrong with the foreign government giving evidence or against one of the candidates, right?
That in itself is problematic. We do not accept information that is going to change the trajectory of our elections from hostile governments. We've made that very clear. He knows that. Even Senator Graham, Lindsey Graham said, this is a mistake, and this is not in line with law, and we want to make sure that that this country, that is a country of law, remains that way.
Aren't you worried, though, that if there was a case of impeachment and it was successful, that there would be a huge backlash? Because Trump has often positioned himself as the representative or the voice of middle America, of white working class Americans that he claims have been marginalized for so long. Now, if he was impeached, he would most certainly try and bill that as an attack on democracy and an attempt by the liberal elite, as he often refers to them, to silence white working class Americans. And in the climate you have in the US, where very easily people can pick up weapons and maybe take action in their own hands, are you not fearful that an attempt at impeachment could create a massive violent backlash?
Absolutely not. I mean, when we think back to the impeachment of Nixon, over 60% of Americans did not believe in starting impeachment proceedings. Right now, it's less than 60%. By the time, within, I think, 10 months of those proceedings, the number of Americans who didn't think we should have started was at 20-some%.
Nixon wasn't a president who would tell his supporters to attack journalists. He wasn't somebody who would rile up that kind of hatred amongst people.
When it comes to the issues of protecting our nation, we can't have it be a political thing. I think there are people who are making political considerations, but this is a matter of protecting our Constitution. We took an oath, and we have to uphold that oath, and we can't allow lawlessness to rule this nation.
Critics of your party say that the reason why the Democrats want to impeach Trump is because they can't beat him at the polls. You still don't have a clear candidate for the 2020 presidential election. Is there anyone in the Democratic Party that you feel represents your views?
There are many. What we are interested in and excited about is the progressive movement that says we don't leave anyone behind. And there are so many amazing candidates that are running on the Democratic candidate that are right now beating him in the polls. I mean, you look at Bernie Sanders, Senator Warren, and even some of the other ones. There is a great opportunity for us to speak directly to the American people, to talk to them about what it means for us to have economic justice, what it means for us to have the kind of prosperity that is supposed to be guaranteed.
So you're on the fence
country.
Between Sanders and Warren? You still haven't decided?
I haven't decided who to support publicly yet, because I think it is too early. There are great opportunities for people to hear from all of the candidates without leaders getting involved in choosing sides.
So you talk about this progressive movement that's being born out of the Democratic Party, together with Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who's a Palestinian American. You have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the youngest in Congress, I believe. You're seen as that new generation, right? But in reality, you're just an exception to the rule. I mean, you don't really have the support of the old guard of the Democratic Party. In fact, when you were under attack by many in the right-wing media, you had the more senior figures in the Democratic Party, like Nancy Pelosi, not come out and defend you. In fact, you know, some would say was perceived as maybe pushing you into a corner.
Yeah, I mean, so support, I think, is measured by the people who duly elected us to represent them in Congress. And so I represent a district that is 70% white. I won my general election by 80%. There are a lot of people who are not just moderates, but also progressives, who are not just young or diverse, that believe in the vision that I believe in. And those are the people that we want to have a conversation with and talk to them about the kind of direction we want to lead this country in.
What's a bigger struggle for you, the struggle against Trump and the right wing, or the struggle against the political establishment that maybe also isn't willing to accept for this progressive politics?
I mean, I think the bigger struggle that we have is against people who don't want change. And so that would be the status quo. Anyone who has benefited from the kind of political structure that existed, that has pinned us against one another, that has allowed for few to benefit on the backs of many, is really who we are struggling against. When we are talking about uplifting all people, it doesn't matter whether you are black, you're white, whether you're an immigrant or not. Majority of us are struggling to pay our student debt. Majority of us are struggling to have proper housing. Majority of us are struggling to have proper education. Majority of us are one step away from filing bankruptcy if we were stricken with an illness. And so that to me is the majority of Americans, and the majority of Americans want people who will put them in the center of our politics and not put the few and the greedy in the center of our politics.
So just one last question on this point. The right wing's attacked you almost constantly since you've come into office, and some commentators have said it's because you embody everything that they hate. So, I mean, you're black, visibly Muslim, woman. Do you think that that's true? That's the reason behind it? And also, aren't you surprised now, going back to your point about the hope that Obama brought in? Don't you feel a bit disappointed that the man who built that idea and concept of hope and based it on the fact that he was challenging a lot of the inherent underlying racism that exists in the political establishment, that he hasn't come out to support you?
I'm more focused on the massive support that I have on a grassroots level, the amount of people that see my story as an inspiration, the kind of rallies that happen in my home state when people like Pence or Trump set foot on the soils of Minnesota. That's the people that I care about. Those are the opinions that matter to me, and those are the people who I fight for.
You didn't answer the question.
But I mean, I think that question is problematic because,
Why?
you know, like if it's as if you're talking to a child and you say,
no, not necessarily.
You don't worry about the support that you have from your parents. Are you worried that you're not getting support from your teacher? Where you place love and affirmation is what matters to you. And I don't really necessarily care about leaders with titles that might support me. What I care about is the people that I fight for, and do I have their support?
One of the things that you were attacked for were comments you made, or part of the comments that you were made about 9/11. Can you clearly state here what your views are about the 9/11 attacks?
I mean, those are horrific attacks. There's no question about that. That's not a debatable thing. Innocent Americans lost their lives that day. We all mourned their deaths. I mean, it was one of the most devastating days of American life, of my life, of my family's, of the families that lost their family members. And so that's not debatable, and I think it's quite disgusting that people even question that and want to debate that.
Why do you think?
I think what is important is the larger point that I was speaking to, which is about making sure that blame isn't placed on a whole faith, that we as Muslims are not collectively blamed for the actions of terrorists. Mm-hmm. I do not blame every single white person when we have a white man who massacres children at a school or in moviegoers in a movie theater. And I think this really horrendous narrative that says that as a Muslim, I'm supposed to explain, apologize for the actions of someone who is also terrorizing me, mm-hmm. Is absurd.
Okay, let's move to more international issues. You're on the Congress's Foreign Affairs Committee. Mm-hmm. There's a revolution taking place in Sudan right now. People have been massacred by the military junta there. There are reports that soldiers and militia loyal to the military junta have raped women before killing them. Why has the US been so silent about Sudan?
I wouldn't say that we have been so silent. I mean, I talked about it in committee. We often are not paying attention to the kind of condemnations that are happening. I think there are two things. We all understand that there is an atrocity happening in Sudan.
But comparative, I need something to put into context here. The same militia that are massacring people, the Janjaweed militia, when they were committing crimes in Darfur, you had the US calling for sanctions, you had much more visible anger and condemnation and action being taken by the US. However, now you have those same militia under the military junta cracking down on pro-democracy protesters, but maybe because the junta is now allied with US's allies in the region and the program to suppress calls for democracy, or maybe because the US isn't interested, or maybe because these are protesters that we don't necessarily know as Americans what they stand for. There definitely is a much more muted response to what is taking place.
I mean, so before you cut me off, what I was getting to was that our response has not been muted. What has been muted is the reporting on our response. Mm-hmm. Chairman Engel on Foreign Affairs, myself and others on the Foreign Affairs Committee, even the ambassador to Africa has spoken about this horrendous silencing of a democratic movement and the atrocities that are being committed. But I think you make a point to whose pain is more felt and whose pain is more deserving of an outcry. And I think the blame really isn't necessarily on us as members of Congress and as leaders, but I think the blame is also placed on the media outlets that refuse to have an outrage 24-hour reporting on atrocities that happen in Muslim countries, in Muslim soil, when the atrocity is being committed by an ally.
So let me ask you this. Venezuela,
Mm-hmm.
and you've spoken about Venezuela, the US has imposed sanctions on it,
Mm-hmm.
has called for emergency UN Security Council
Mm-hmm.
discussions on it. In fact, Vice President Mike Pence addressed one of them,
Mm-hmm.
even though that it's very clear that there is both support and opposition to the government there.
Mm-hmm.
Yet with Sudan, it is, according to most international observers and human rights organizations, the vast majority of people are actually opposed to the military junta. It's not as clear-cut, or it's a lot more clear-cut rather than Venezuela. When you look at these two examples, where you have a very clear concerted political program to isolate a government that still enjoys some support within its people on the one hand, and was elected through what many would consider to be free and fair elections in Venezuela, and on the other hand you have a military junta that wasn't elected, has committed massacres, yet you have a much softer response to that. Explain that for us.
So now I think I understand your question more clearly. I mean, when we're thinking about the way that this administration is handling our foreign policy, that I think is where you notice these extreme hypocrisies that have existed and might have existed, but now are very clear. They're not gray anymore, right? It's very black and white. And so in the case of, and you could see that black and white between our reaction to Sudan and our reaction to Venezuela. The interesting piece, I think, here is the regional actors within this conflict in Sudan. I mean, we have Saudi Arabia and the Emirates who have had a long history, at least 24-year history, of shutting down democratic movements in the region, who have had a hand in the oppression of people who seek to have liberation and self self-reliance and self-determination. And their interest really is what we seem to advance when it comes to that region. And I talked about how can we make a decision to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, knowing that they have been part of causing one of the most atrocious humanitarian crises in Yemen, when we know that they have a hand in what's happening right now in Sudan, what's happening in Libya, and I mean, the list can go on and on and on, and continue to say that they are an ally when we know that there is more that needs to be done to make sure that we tell them as allies that we want them to carry out an interest that represents our values.
Why do you think that arms are still being sold to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates? Why is it that despite Congress even trying to maybe limit some of those arms sales, you've had the president circumvent Congress? And what should be done to put an end to that? Because a lot of people, Congresswoman, have been talking about Russian collusion with the Trump administration, foreign intervention from other powers like Russia. But the influence of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia on the political status here in the United States today has largely gone, even though maybe a bit reported in the media, but has gone unchecked by lawmakers.
Our allyship with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates is immoral. I believe that it is one of the most absurd allyships. It doesn't fit with any of our values. And, you know, when we think about what is in the interest of our national security, it is entrusting them to help us with that. It's like having, trusting a thief to watch over your shop. Mm-hmm. We know that they can't be trusted in that process, and so this profiteering process and the kind of interest that we haven't even talked about between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates really is one that we are hopeful we'll get to the bottom of it. We are in the process of investigating really how this particular allyship and this relationship is not in the best interest of the United States and the American people. How do we bring that to light so that the American people are aware of the kind of really corruption that might be involved in it, and how do we make sure that our weapons are not getting in the hands of people who are going to use them to commit more atrocities. We had examples of weapons that are offensive and not just for use of defense, which the State Department, is saying that they have been interested in helping Saudi Arabia defend not only their interests but the interest of Americans. But we're selling them offensive weapons. These are weapons that have been used to attack schools. They've been weapons that have been used to attack hospitals in Yemen.
So do you believe that Saudi Arabia and the UAE
bridges.
Should be sanctioned? Sanctions should be imposed on them?
Oh, certainly. Mm-hmm. We, should have an arms embargo and not be able to sell weapons to countries that are committing human rights atrocities.
I want to end with a personal question, if you don't mind. Your journey started off as a refugee, ended up as a lawmaker in the world's most powerful country. Tell us a bit about that. Maybe the secret behind it. Was this always your passion? Was this always your aim? How did you reach to where you are? Who has influenced you most in this journey?
I mean, my journey is one that really has been about just fighting to see a brighter day. And I don't think I really had a destination. I was always very present in the journey. I had a very beautiful childhood in Somalia up to the age of 8. Lived through the horrors of life in a refugee camp. Went through the disastrous transition of not just teenagehood, but learning a language in a new country. And found, I think, a space where I could thrive as someone who really believed that you have a role in what your tomorrow looks like. And so my work in trying to make sure that I wasn't just guaranteeing a better tomorrow for myself, but for my neighbors, for my children, for everyone around me, has led me on a path of political organizing and activism that got me elected into the State House, defeating a 44-year incumbent, and now has given me the opportunity and the privilege of serving my state and my country in the United States of Congress.
Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Thank you so much for having me.